everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host, and I'm your moderator. I'm also the creator and the publisher of thechocolatelife.com. Today, we're going to be doing a follow-up on a recent episode of David Nilsen's Bean to Barstool podcast, where I was a guest, and then a follow-up episode on Pod Save Chocolate last week, where we had a chance to talk about similarities and differences when we talk about craft beer, craft chocolate, judging, pairing, and all sorts of stuff like that. Before we jump into today's episode, what I want to do is remind everybody that this is the homepage of thechocolatelife.com. You can go there right now. You can see, all of the past posts that we've done. And for every single episode of Pod Save Chocolate, I put together a post. And this is the post for today's episode of Pod Save Chocolate. This episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like all episodes, is sponsored by members of The Chocolate Life. So go over to thechocolatelife.com, click on the join button, and become a member today. There's always a free member, right? And but if you have the resources to be able to support us, I don't do Patreon, not doing advertising, not doing anything like that. You can become a member and support directly. And your support, free or otherwise, is always greatly appreciated. And if you're watching on YouTube, give a thumbs up and like the video, subscribe to the channel, support what it is that we're doing. All right. So with all that out of the way, one final reminder: if you're watching this, go into the live chat on YouTube or in the comments on LinkedIn or Facebook, and let me know where in the world you're connecting from. Right, and I'll give a shout out on the screen and say thank you very much for the shout out. And if you have any comments or questions during the course of the hour, you can go into the live chat or the comments and get those into the feed. I'll see them and I'll get them up on screen and I'll get your questions asked and answered. So one of the reasons why I put together a post every week, number one, is here are the archive links. In the future, if you're watching this, you probably don't need the archive links, but they're there. But also because what I do is I provide links to resources. And I don't expect you to be able to look at the URLs or anything like that. So the post provides the links to the resources. So if you're watching on a computer and you have screen real estate, you can go follow along live, or after the fact, if you want to go back and take a detailed look at any of the things that I talk about during the episode, you can go and you can see what it is that I see. And so the first two links that are provided are, number one, is you can go and listen to the Bean to Barstool podcast. Just click on the play link and you'll be able to hear what it is that David and I talk about, as I was a guest on his podcast. And then if you want to, you can go and click on this post here. I'm not going to do that. Actually, no, it'll take you to YouTube. It'll start playing automatically. But what you can do is you can listen to what David had to say in response on Pod Save Chocolate. And this is not a requirement for today, but it is. You might want to go back afterwards and take a look at those episodes and see what some of the genesis, so some of what my thinking is about why I am making the comments I am today, because I had a chance to think at length about what I said on David's podcast before he came on mine, and then I've had another week to look at what it is that David responded on Pod Save Chocolate and how it all got together. And I think there's some really, really important things that we can talk about, answering the question: what is it that craft chocolate can learn from craft beer? And that's where I want to go here. What is it that craft chocolate can learn from craft beer? And what are the differences between craft chocolate and craft beer, and wine and coffee? So let's jump in. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of styles. So beer styles, right? And did a little bit of research. And so there's a Wikipedia article, and it turns out that in modern conception, Michael Jackson, very, very famous beer writer, wrote a book called The World Guide to Beer. First edition was back in 1977. And in it, it was the first systematic review of different styles of beer. Although the idea or the understanding of different styles of beer goes back, according to this Wikipedia article, to at least 2000 BC. So the idea of organizing styles of beer is one that has been around for a long time. And if we scroll down through this, it'll talk about the different types of beer, the history of beer styles. And if you're at all interested in this, this is a good place, because what you've got at the end of the articles, a whole lot of bit of resources and a big bibliography that you can sort through. So I'm citing my sources for this indirectly. But one of the things that the article talks about, the Wikipedia article talks about, is what are the elements of beer style? And the elements of beer style have to do with, number one, appearance. And it turns out that there is a sort of a technical description of what beer colors are and the labels used to describe them. Right? We talk about aroma and flavor and mouthfeel. These are all things that we talk about in chocolate. Strength is an interesting context. It's related to the concept of specific gravity and then alcohol concentration. Strength, this is a measure of the amount of alcohol. So might be analogous to what we think of as cocoa content, maybe something there. But the kinds of yeasts that are used, we don't think about the yeasts that are used during fermentation as an element of chocolate styles. Right, so there's the different kind of grain that's used. In chocolate, there's only one grain. It's cacao, although it might be coupe Wassu if we're doing something related, but we're talking about chocolate, there's only one grain. We're not adding bittering agents. The type of water we use, not important. Ingredients, we don't think of ingredients in chocolate typically as part of the style of chocolate, right? And so this is a really, really quick overview on what it is that beer styles look like. Now, what we can do is then there's a companion article called A List of Beer Styles on Wikipedia. I go through there. And what you do is, this is an alphabetical list, sorted. You can change the sort if you want to. And what we do is we have Michael Jackson's original, or the name he gave for it, another beer writer, Roger Protz, the Brewers Association description, as well as the campaign for real beer and the Beer Judging Association. So here what you have is different styles of beer and different names of different styles of beer. And what you do is you find that there are slight differences in the terminology that is used, but it's very, very specific, right? One of the sort of rabbit holes I went down is, you've got a style of beer which is called a goose, right? And then you have one up here, which is a gose. And what's the difference? And what you can do a little bit of look, how are they related? Again, I use an AI assisted search engine called Perplexity. And what it does is it not only provides me a summarization down here under the answer, but then what it also does is gives me sources that I can go and do more detail if I want to. But goes and goose, basically, one is a German style and one is a Belgian style. And so you have the different language associated with it, the different types of fermentation, different types of yeasts, and things like that. So it turns out that linguistically they sound like they're related, goose and goose, in terms of pronunciation, they are in fact different styles of beer. And I am sort of vaguely aware of that, but I was inspired to go find the differences. And so here we find just an alphabetical list of beers, and then hybrid and specialty beers. And then we have this sorted by origin. And what I want to do is I want to get away from this particular listing and go take a look at the listing which is given at the Brewers Association, excuse me. And here is their association. Here are the beer style guidelines, right? This is just one selection of them. British Association is likely to be slightly different. But what they do is they break the different styles of beer down into broad categories. So one of the categories is ales, another of the categories is lagers. Then you have a hybrid ale lager category, and we'll go through them. But within the ale style category, right, we have ale styles that originated in the United Kingdom, ale styles that originated in North America, ale styles that originated in Belgium and France, ale styles in Ireland, German, and then ale styles that originated in other countries, right? And then you have lager styles. It's not quite as differentiated. So you have European and American lagers, and then lagers from other parts of the world. You don't specifically have, Belgian lagers as opposed to German lagers. All right, so it's not quite as differentiated. You see it down here. And Oktoberfest, you have a Märzen, a Rotbier. I mean, very, very specific and very, very detailed. And then you have the hybrid mixed lagers or ale. And it's just one category. And here is you have sessions and some fruit lambics, pumpkin spiced beer, right? It's very, very detailed. And why is that important? Is if we were to go, for example, to take a look at the characteristics of a contemporary American style lager, for example. So here we are. We go look at the American style lager. Why is this important, right? So we give there is a rubric around color, clarity, perceived aroma and flavor of malt and hops, perceived bitterness, characteristics that are associated with fermentation, and body, and then some additional flavor notes. Right? And what this is this a rubric, as David explained to me, this is a rubric for judges. So number one, if you are judging a beer which is labeled as an American style light lager, right, then what you would be doing is you would be looking for a color of very light to pale. And if it's a different color, you don't rate it as highly, or you mark it down, right? If there's a perceived a high or medium to high malt aroma and flavor, then it doesn't meet the definition of an American style light lager. If there's hoppiness, right, it's not a light lager. If it's a lot of perceived bitterness, it's not a light lager. So what these parameters do, and what these rubrics do, is they tell someone who is judging, right, or someone who is making this kind of beer, exactly what the characteristics of that beer need to be in order to be a part of that category. And this is a really interesting, what is the difference between an American style light lager and a contemporary American style light lager? Again, when you enter a beer into a judging competition, you need to go and make sure that you enter it into the right category. And this is a challenge that we faced. Dustin Cornett, who's the organizer of the Craft Chocolate Challenge, he would receive an entry form in which the maker entered his chocolate into one category, and what Dustin needed to do is he needed to say, nah, it's not quite the right category. We need to move it into another category in order for it to be judged appropriately. So this is really, really interesting, and it talks a lot about the nature of, number one, the history, right? We've been thinking about beer styles for over 2,000 years, right? And the nature of judging. Right? And so I wanted to go and take a look at some other things, right? Some other places where I might be able to find some information about chocolate styles. And so I went to, Mark Christian C-Spot, went to the Chocolate Atlas, and went to chocolate types. And what we find is we have white chocolate as a type, we have milk chocolate as a type, right? We have dark milk chocolate as a type, right? And this is semi-dark, right? And it's important to know that these are Mark's individual, right, ideas for what styles are. There is no industry-wide organization in the United States, in Europe, anywhere, right, which oversees any kind of dictionary of styles. Right? So there's no sort of canonical reference. Here, we as an industry are all going to agree on this is what styles are. And styles are important because they provide a framework for makers to say, if I am going to enter a competition and I want to enter into this category, this is what it is that I need to do. This is how, these are the limitations for what can be on it. Right? And then also as a judge, I have some very, very specific limitations. I have some parameters. And as David described to me, one of the things that is interesting about this is judging, is you could be judging a beer competition and you could be faced with a beer that you thought was just a really phenomenal beer, right, in a given category. And yet, because the beer did not exactly meet the judging rubric, so, I'm here, and I'm going to be looking at this Scottish style light ale, right? So I'm judging Scottish style light ales. There's an entry into this category, and I'm looking at it, and maybe It's the color is slightly off, the haze, the appearances, clarity is not where it's supposed to be for this particular style. Even though this beer is a phenomenal beer, I would mark it down because it doesn't meet the criteria of the category. Right? And that's really, really important to understand about beer judging, and it's how chocolate is very different. Number one, we don't have anything like this kind of clarity and specificity when it comes to styles, right? Basically, we have dark milk white, and then where what are the other what are the other what are the other ways we go? So for example, maybe well before we do that, number one, so I showed you some of what Mark Christian had to say about this. Another thing is I went to look and said, okay, does the Fine Chocolate Industry Association have a canonical list of styles? And the answer, again, this is a perplexity review, and basically no, they don't define what the different styles of chocolate are, right? They're focused on defining what fine means as opposed to something else. But is fine chocolate a category, a style? I have trouble believing that it might be. And then I went to look at the Fine Cocoa and Chocolate Institute. If they had a list of styles, and they said, no, they don't have a list of styles, go refer to the FCIA, right? And so although they do make an interesting distinction, is that bonbons, truffles, and chocolate bars are considered separately here. And I don't know exactly where they got that. I haven't looked to see where they are. So we have, I'm asking about the Fine Cocoa and Chocolate Industry, and I get to the Fine Chocolate Industry Association. I get to a member of the FCIA in their database, a company called Datalate. Then Nate Saul, and his business, again, Cocoa Terra, again, related to the FCIA. There are two more references, another FCIA reference, and confectionery production, a chocolate glossary guide. Interesting. So I am going to take some of those references and put it in today's post, especially the confectionery production one. Also a direct link to the FCIA glossary page, so you can figure out if there's anything interesting there that you want to do. Right. I also went and said, okay, I went to the WSET, so Wine Spirits Education Trust. I went and took a look. I'm sorry, for some reason it reset the view. How many different styles of wine are there? Right? And it turns out that there are not that very many different styles of wine according to WSET, right? We have still wine as a category, but then within still wine as a family, let's think about it that way, we have attributes. We can say, what is the color, right? So is it a white wine, a red wine, or a rosé? And then we have examples of grapes that contribute to those subtypes of still wines. And we do this based on other characteristics, sweetness, right? But these are all still, no effervescence. So everything fits under that category. And then what we do is go back and we have a category of sparkling wines, and we have examples of them. So Champagne in France, Cava in Spain, Prosecco in Italy. And then it is, if it's got effervescence, it's a sparkling wine. That's really, really simple. And then we have examples of different kinds of sparkling wines. We have fortified wines. That's a wine to which a spirit has been added. Port is probably the most interesting example. And there are such things as fortified sparkling wines. There's a guy by the name of Peter Rumball in Australia who makes a fortified sparkling Shiraz, which is really phenomenal. It's on the sweet side. It is a dessert wine, but if you ever get a chance to try a Peter Rumball, Rumball, I think is the way you spell it, sparkling Shiraz out of the Barossa Valley in Australia, go take a look. It's really, really quite phenomenal. But then the fortified wines is another category, and that's it, right? There are 3 styles of wine, right? The styles of wine are sparkling, still, and fortified. That's it. And all kinds of wine, right? Every wine in the world will fit under those categories. Pretty cool. That gives us an idea about how to organize. Then I went to look and said, oh my gosh, what are different styles of coffee? Right? How many different styles of coffee are there? And this is where it gets, I think, really, really interesting for me, is that coffee styles are based obviously on the beverage, how we're consuming it, not the bean. So I don't have to worry about that aspect of it. But we have a black coffee, right? And then we have a red eye coffee and a lungo, excuse me, and notice that I have a ristretto here. And so for me, this doesn't work. So within the context of black coffee, I have a black coffee, and then examples of black coffee would be a red eye and a lungo and a ristretto, because there's no added milk. And then I have coffee with milk added to it, right? And so there are some coffees which must have milk into it, like a flat white, a cafe au lait, macchiato, a cortado, a doppio, a latte. These are examples of chocolate with milk in them. And then we have Americano. Could go either way. It's just an espresso with added water. You can put milk in it or not. We have Dalgona coffee, which is not listed in here. Affogato is an ice cream with coffee on top of it. Is it a style? So there's mixing metaphors, and there are things we're looking at. I mean, there are much more detailed versions of this. But I think that one of the challenges with this organization is that it's too flat. So everything exists on the same level. And I would go and I would say, how do we take the sort of wine examples? So we have coffee without milk, coffee with milk, specialty coffees, and we could do that. And then within that, we might say, here's an Italian style this, and here's a French style that, adding some of the things in from the beer world, talking about where the drink originated. That could be pretty cool, right? And so I'm going and I'm taking a look at these things, and I'm going, all right, how do we go about applying this to chocolate? How do we go about applying some of these ideas to chocolate? And so I think, excuse me if I can, I'm going to jump and talk about styles generally. So I think one way to do this is to think about, number one, broad categories. And within broad categories, have very, very specific sub-examples which relate to specific ideas. So for example, we could have a dark chocolate category. Now, there is no legal definition of dark chocolate anywhere in the world, right? So neither the Code of Federal Regulations here in the United States or the Codex Alimentarius, which is used in many other places in the world, talk about dark chocolate. It fits into the category of what's called sweet chocolate, semi-sweet, bittersweet. And in the definition of sweet chocolate here in the United States, dairy ingredients are allowed. And so one of the things, for example, anhydrous milk fat, butter oil would be something. Whey powder could be used, right? So I can provide I can add dairy-derived ingredients and still call it sweet chocolate. So what we might do is we might take an approach that says, I'm going to put together a category called dark chocolate. So in the context of what we're doing, dark chocolate contains no dairy ingredients, just no dairy ingredients. And within dark chocolate, what are some styles of dark chocolate? And number one is I might have a style of dark chocolate, which is a 2-ingredient dark chocolate. That would be different from a 3-ingredient dark chocolate, which might be different from a 4-ingredient dark chocolate, and which might be different from a 5-ingredient dark chocolate. So we can say, here are styles of dark chocolate. So one question I have, and this may be, listen, do you agree or disagree? Go into the comments, let me know, right? But is the notion of single origin versus blended, would that be a style? Right? Interesting to know. And then so within the context of beer, we have this idea of specific gravity, which is what alcohol is. And that's an instrumental measurement, which is not incredibly precise. But would we do something like saying cocoa content? Is a high cocoa content chocolate, as a high cocoa content 2-ingredient chocolate, a style of chocolate? Do we want to include cocoa content as a measure of a part of a style, right? Interesting concept. My personal preference would be to say no. We don't want to include that idea as a part of it. And I don't even know about single origin versus blended, although I'm willing to go there. I'm willing to say a 2-ingredient single origin is going to be different from a 2-ingredient blended, right? And so my expectations of one are different from an expectation of another. In beer, we talk about hops and grains, and so we can talk about the kind of cocoa beans that are used as a way of differentiating. So that makes some sense to think about it that way, so that we have single origin versus blended as a way of thinking about styles of chocolate as opposed to cocoa content. So because it doesn't really talk about, I think, anything that is useful in terms of differentiation. We might list the cocoa content of a particular bar, but I don't necessarily know that high cocoa content versus low content is different. Although what we could say is there is a French style of chocolate making. And so if I were to do a 2-ingredient chocolate that is French style, or a 3-ingredient chocolate that is French style, one of my expectations of a French style chocolate is that has a higher cocoa butter content, right? And so I could define a French style dark chocolate as opposed to a 2-ingredient style dark chocolate. Now there's something there, I think, in terms of can I apply a geographic sort of notion to a style. I don't know how many there are. When I founded my first rating system back in 2001, and I was thinking about that this morning, I sort of knew that one way to differentiate chocolate was to think about styles. And so I created a northern, so I divided the world up into a Northern European style of chocolate, which I said was tended to be lighter and sweeter. And then a Southern European style chocolate, which tended to be darker and more chocolate forward, tend to be more bitter. And that would be sort of the difference between maybe an espresso and cafe au lait or a cappuccino. Those would be one way of thinking about it. And so you could say, listen, I tend to prefer espresso over cafe au lait, so I might prefer this style of chocolate over another. American style chocolate making was when there were flavors in it. The flavors were really important, more important than the chocolate. You said raspberry, it just sort of beat you over the head with raspberry. And so it could set your expectations for what kind of flavor experience and texture experience you were getting towards. And so I think there's really some value in terms of that. And I also think that one of the things to think about is we're not just focusing on chocolate bars. If we're going to do this, we need to be inclusive of all kinds of products that include cocoa. And so, for example, here's an interesting question. We've got a bonbon category, and bonbon, we're just going to use the French term, right? And that French term is also going to encompass what the Belgians call a praline, right? And also what the French call truffles. Right? So the bonbon, which is just means good, right? I love that name. So we have different notions. One of which is I have a shell molded bonbon, right? I have a slabbed ganache bonbon, and I have a hand rolled bonbon. So those are different styles because the presentation is different, and my expectations for how they're constructed are very, very different. And in my experience, a French style shell molded bonbon is going to be different from a Belgian style, right? Shell molded bonbon. And so I think that there is value in thinking about the things that way. And within the slabbed ganache bonbon, you do have the unenrobed slabbed ganache, the pavé style, which is very, very French, and I've seen it in Japan as well. I don't know that I've seen it in many other places. But I think that within that idea, we have a framework for putting together a list of styles of kinds of chocolate. And then we could have a nut paste style and a beverage style, and we'd be able to go and figure out things that way, right? The question for you, people who are watching this, go into the comments, whether you're watching afterwards, let me know. What do you think about the idea of thinking about styles this way? Does it make sense to think about styles of chocolate in more detail than just dark milk white and inclusions, right? And if we're going to think about chocolate this way, does the idea of having very, very sort of high-end, broader family styles like we find in wine and we find in beer, and then having much more specific examples of this style of chocolate with differences in terms of what criteria we're going to apply in order for a particular chocolate to fit within this category. The reason why I say it is I think it makes in a much more sense than this is micro batch. So this is made 8 pounds at a time versus this is made at 40 pounds at a time, right? So I think it makes a whole lot more sense to think about it that way. For example, I mean, let me know whether or not it makes sense to pursue that kind of approach, because I think that, you know, Michael Jackson singularly, him on his own in the late 1980s, put this guide to styles together, and which was fundamental to the creation of the modern craft beer movement, and our understanding of beer in general and beer judging particularly. And so I think I personally think it's a worthy endeavor, right? And so please let me know in the comments, send me an email. If you're a member of the Chocolate Life, go down to the comments on the Chocolate Life and add them there. If you don't want to do them on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, so just let me know. All right. So the second thing I want to talk about here is judging. So the styles obviously have an impact on judging. And so, as I said, and I've covered, how do beer styles affect beer judging? And the answer to that question is there's a very, very specific description of what a beer style needs to be. And the role of a judge is to say, does this beer match that style, and how closely? Now, I could be just a phenomenally tasty beer and not match the style guidelines, and I would not be judged highly. Now, there may be a separate judging, which could be a best in show judging, where judges get together and they talk about individual beers irrespective of the categories that they fit in, irrespective of the styles. And so we can call out, right, really, really interesting beers without thinking about the style that they belong to. So I think that's really, really important, right? And so how are some differences between judging beer and judging chocolate? We've answered that question as well. And how are judging beer and chocolate different from judging wine and coffee? Right? And so I think that right now, chocolate and wine are judged fairly similarly. So in the sense that they are descriptive processes, what we do is we go through, we describe, we have some rubric that we're going to judge the different elements to. And in the end, we give them a number. And that number is the subjective rating by each individual judge, according to whatever judging rubric there is. And there is no standing judging rubric. There's no standard judging rubric when it comes to chocolate. One of the goals of WSET, the Wine Spirits Education Trust, Wine and Spirits Education Trust, is that there is a standard rubric and there is a standard educational system. And everybody who goes through WSET is trained in the same way, which is valuable. And we don't have that yet in chocolate. We have a couple of attempts to do it. We don't have anything which is as universally accepted as WSET is. Although there are attempts to do something WSET-like in chocolate, which is good to know. But judging beer is very different from both judging wine and coffee and chocolate, because judging beer is all about, is this a good example of the style? And so it's very, very different. We're not judging wine like, is this a good example of Cabernet Sauvignon? That's not it, right? It's based on a very, very different set of descriptive criteria. Whereas judging beer is more about prescriptive criteria, right? Which is important to know. And coffee is different entirely, because while there are barista competitions where what we're judging is the competence of a barista to develop a tasty beverage, right? Nobody who's not a part of that judging competition is going to be able to taste anything. Like, I could taste beer, I could taste chocolate, I could taste wine that were judged. But if there's a barista competition, chances are, well, listen, James Hoffman was a barista champion. If I were to go to someplace in London, Proofrock or someplace like that, where, James is associated with, I might be able to get, James's specific interpretation of something, but I wouldn't be able to do it. Coffee is different entirely, again, because what coffee judge and Q grading is all around the beans, right? So I'm judging the quality of the beans. Specialty coffee is anything that gets an 80 and above in terms of the Q grading score. We do have the cacao of excellence in chocolate, but we're not rating hops that way. We're not rating grains that way. We're not thinking about malt that way. We don't think about rating grapes that way. So they're fundamentally very, very different things. And we need to understand that what are we rating and how are we rating it and why are we judging it the way we're doing? What's the impact of what it is that we're doing? So really important to think about that. I wanted to take a quick reset because we're more than halfway through the hour. I want to thank everybody who's joined me today. Go into the comments or the live chat. Let me know where in the world you're connecting from, or if you have a question or a comment. Also put that in the comments. I'll get it up on screen, which is what I'm going to do after I mention that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode, is sponsored by the members of the Chocolate Life. Go over to thechocolatelife.com, become a member, and help support what we're doing. If you're watching on YouTube, give this a thumbs up and subscribe to the Pod Safe Chocolate YouTube channel. I would appreciate that. And so from Clement Orlando Bob, who is St. Lucia, I think, if I remember correctly. Lots to unpack. You might need another show or maybe a paper. I think you approached this topic years ago. I probably need to listen again. You know, Clement, I did 150 episodes of the Chocolate Life Live. This is now getting on to episode 60 of Pod Safe Chocolate. I did roughly 150 episodes on Clubhouse. And so over the course of more than 300 episodes, I think I have talked about this before. It wouldn't surprise me, but I haven't really talked about it from this perspective. I mean, before I did it primarily from thinking about chocolate styles and I think my own experience in terms of how I came up with my own rating system, all right? Because when I was creating my rating system, I didn't want it to be, you're in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much. You're on Tobago, Trinidad. I knew it was down there somewhere. I just forgot. But there is that I may have spoken before, different context, and not so deeply after having a chance to talk about this with David, right, and who bridges chocolate and beer. Now, I have known many certified beer judge. I spent a lot of time in New York City before I moved to Arizona, working with the New York City Craft Brewers Guild, a number of craft beer events in which I put together chocolate. And so I had been thinking about it, but not quite the same way. Anyway, so I wanted to make that differentiation. Chances are, and I am going to be pursuing this idea in more detail to see if I can get something which makes an enormous amount of to make something that I can come to consensus around, because I think there is a value in doing this. I think there's incredible value in doing this. All right. So one of the things that David and I talked about was around the definition. What makes craft beer? What makes craft chocolate? So what does make craft chocolate? What does craft beer? Why is there no craft wine movement? Interesting question. We do have artisan cheese. Artisan, in this particular case, fits into a sort of craft style of making, depending on how we define craft, right? And then in the world of coffee, we just use the word specialty. We're not really using craft. Some people use craft coffee, more like handcrafted coffee, in the roasting and in the making. Maybe I'm using a manual espresso machine as opposed to a fully automatic espresso machine. Probably, in a commercial setting, chances are I'm not using a hand grinder. And so, again, the definition of craft, needs to be carefully considered here. So what makes a craft beer craft? It turns out that there's a craft beer association. And the definition of craft is changing to meet the changing demands of the market and the changing demands of its members. So one of the examples that David gave was Sam Adams. It's not the name of the brewery, but that's the name of the brands. The Boston Brewing. Is that the definition of craft over the course of the years has changed to accommodate the way some larger brewers that have been traditionally associated with craft have changed, right? And I understand the politics of that and why it might need to be done, but I think that defining what craft beer is based upon maximum amount of production, you can only be a craft brewer if you produce less than 6 million barrels a year. And I think about people who say, well, you can't be a craft chocolate maker if you process 50 tons of beer or 50 tons of beans. And the answer is, why not? I mean, we accept that at 6 million barrels. That's a lot of beer, right? And so if it works for the craft beer community, how come it doesn't work for the craft chocolate community, right? And the other part of craft beer is about ownership. I think you can't be more than 24% owned by some other beverage company, right? So I could be owned 24% by AB InBev, and I could still be considered craft. But the moment AB InBev took a larger position, I'm no longer craft beer. And I don't know that I buy that. And within the world of craft chocolate, within the world of specialty chocolate, that's not a way of thinking about it that makes any sense, because we don't think about whether or not you're craft based on ownership and investment, right? That's not the way we think about it. And I think it makes no sense to think about it that way. I think the best way to think about craft chocolate, right, is to think about um, intent, right? And one of the things that David said is that one of the challenges associated with craft beer is that defined itself, right, against industrial beer. So whatever industrial beer is, craft beer is not going to be that. And that, I think, is what drives definitions around size, right, and about ownership, right? So a craft beer is not going to be an industrial beer, and industrial beer is around um, capacity and the amount of and where the ownership is. And I think the best way to think about craft chocolate is craft, and industrial chocolate is industrial chocolate, in a way that can't be co-opted. And this is the important thing. It's like, how do you keep big chocolate from co-opting the phrase, which they have done with bean to bar. Bean to bar describes a process, right? It just says, I buy beans and I make bars from those beans. And then what we try to do is we try to conflate or layer on. Conflate is maybe the wrong term there. The way to say, in order to be a bean to bar chocolate maker, everything must be done in-house, right? So you need to bring the beans into your factory, and all of the equipment and everything is done in your factory. And I'm not an absolutist in that sense, right? Because I think that there is value in, for example, what it is that Cho has done in sending their chocolate maker to a producing country, oversee the roast, oversee the grind and the liquor, and then bring the liquor back to the factory in Emeryville and finish the chocolate there. Is that bean to bar? I think, why not? Right? It can't, if Cho didn't own a farm, is it farm to bar? Is it tree to bar? Probably not, because they don't own the farms. But that's, we have to be very, very careful about what we're defining and why. And where I come down on all of this is that what makes craft chocolate, as opposed to industrial chocolate, is that industrial chocolate makers start out with the end goal in mind. Right? So the industrial chocolate maker says, my customers expect that the flavor is going to be exactly the same, right? Or my customers demand that the rheology, the flow characteristics, right, is going to be exactly the same from batch to batch to batch. If I'm running a production line and I'm expecting the chocolate to flow a particular way because I'm running it at thousands of pieces per minute, or whatever, hundreds and hundreds of pieces per minute, if I change the rheology of chocolate, I need to adjust my machines, right? And the average big industrial candy maker doesn't want to adjust their machines for differences in the technical characteristics of the chocolate, right? If I'm using an unsweetened chocolate in a recipe, then what I want the pH of that chocolate to be the same every single time if I'm using a chemical leavening agent, because I'm expecting a certain amount of acidity to react with a certain amount of this leavening agent to provide a certain amount of rising power, right? Generating CO2, right? And if the pH of the chocolate changes, then the rise is going to change, and I might get some versions of the cake that are much more dense, and some versions of the cake that rise outside of the baking pan, and I have something that looks weird, right? And I need to figure out how to deal with that, right? And so an industrial chocolate maker is an industrial chocolate maker when they start out with the end goal in mind. They know that no matter what the inputs are, the output needs to be X. And they do everything they can in the manufacturing process to make sure that X is the same, the end result. And this is where we find things like adding a lot of vanilla comes in, right? Because it turns out the vanilla is, in the chocolate industry, it's called a masking aroma. It's designed to cover up defects and to cover up differences. And if I add a lot of vanilla, then I can get as close as I possibly can with my other ingredients, right? And then put a little vanilla or a lot of vanilla on top, and it tastes the same to most people. So that's where we're going to go. That's what makes an industrial chocolate maker an industrial chocolate maker, right? Whereas for a craft chocolate maker, what they say is, I have beans, and every new lot of beans from the same producing country or from a different producing country or a different part of the same producing country, every lot of beans, right, from one harvest, maybe it's the peak harvest and the off harvest, or maybe it's 1 year to another year, every bean offers an opportunity for creative expression. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to filter the beans through my perception of what I want to make, my aesthetic profile. And what I'm going to do as a chocolate maker is I'm going to do my best to maximize the flavor expression of those beans, right? And that's what makes craft craft. It's not that I'm doing it 5 pounds at a time, 500 pounds at a time, or 50 pounds at a time. It doesn't matter whether I'm using a wet grinder, a melanger, or a 3-roll mill, or a ball mill, or any other kind of processing technology. It has to do with intent. What is it that I'm trying to create, right? And I'm trying to maximize the expression of flavor from the ingredients I have, because that is the ingredient that I have to work with. It's not like beer where I can change the hops, I can change the yeast, I got all these other things that I can add, right? This is what I've got, right? And so I think it's really, really important to understand those differences. And that's part of where the exploration, talking to David, has led me to, and thinking about how are beer styles, right, put together differently from chocolate styles? How are wine styles different? How are coffee styles different, right? And how do we go about organizing them? Is that this actually reinforces my idea, my personal intuition about craft, although I prefer the term specialty, right? And eventually want to get to specialty chocolate as any chocolate made with specialty beans. And then let's work upon what the definition of specialty cocoa beans are, and because it's worked incredibly well for coffee, right? And I think that I think that is the direction to go to, over like the Craft Beer Association way of thinking about it, or the Brewers Association way of thinking about it. And then finally, what I want to talk about for the last couple of minutes here is what are meaningful differences when it comes to the world of beer and chocolate and coffee and wine. And the first one is around the notion of community. Now, when I was in New York City, I spent time working with, Jimmy Carboni of Jimmy's Number 43, Standings upstairs, Burp Castle. I had friends who were certified beer judges. I cooked for the New York City Beer Expo, for a festival called Pig Island, and things like that. So I was doing chocolate and beer at craft beer and food festivals, right? And I did that over the course of, I want to say, 7 or 8 years. I mean, it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot about the home brewing community and the craft brewing community in New York City. And one of the things about chocolate is that most of the community that exists around chocolate is online, right? So I will go to chocolatealchemy.com. I will go to thechocolateLife.com. I will go to welltempered.com, Welltempered on Facebook, right? Almost all of the community around chocolate making is online. Now, I would argue that, yes, I could go to the Northwest Chocolate Festival, or I could go to the Dallas Chocolate Festival, but that community exists for only the length of the festival. When the festival is over, that community dissipates. And one of the things about the New York City Home Brewers Guild is they would get together on a regular basis, maybe not monthly, but more than once a year. And everybody would bring the beer that they had brewed, and everybody would taste everybody else's beer, right? And it was a barbecue often, sometimes at a beautiful state park. I remember going up to a Westchester Park, Croton-on-Hudson, right on the Hudson River, and spending the afternoon, throwing frisbees and playing football and barbecuing and drinking beer. I mean, it was a lot of fun. We don't have anything like that for the home chocolate maker. There's nothing like that. And I think that this community, similarly, we've got community around coffee. I think a lot of community around coffee is online. James Hoffman is a great example about that. But community in coffee is associated with rituals. I'm going to my local specialty coffee shop, right? So wherever it is, I mean, originally here in the US, it was Starbucks, or maybe it was Pete's, depending on where you lived. And now there are hundreds of, like, one or two or three door chains. But I would go to the coffee shop, right? And there was a group of people associated with going there. I mean, often I'd take my computer, or I might, if I was a high-tech startup, I might have my colleagues, and we'd go, and the coffee shop became the place where we got together. And there was a shared experience around coffee and learning about coffee. And that's one of the things that, I mean, Howard Schultz's genius is not that he figured out, well, part of it is he figured out how to sell $1 cup of coffee for $4. But the other one was realizing that to do that, he wasn't selling coffee, he was selling lifestyle, he was selling experience, right? And we don't have anything really like that when it comes to chocolate. There is no equivalent of a home brewers guild for home chocolate makers. And how would the world be different if there were such a thing as a home chocolate makers guild, like there was a home brewers guild? I think the discussions we'd be having are very, very different. And also, we have rituals around drinking beer, right? In the UK, it's I go to the pub after work. Right here in the United States, I will go to a sports bar after work where I'll sit down with friends, I'll watch a game, and we'll sit and talk. And even if I don't know anybody at the sports club, we're looking at our favorite team, and there is community around drinking beer, right? There's community around going to a pub or a bar after work and having a glass of wine. There are community, and those are rituals, not just community. There are community and rituals about going to a coffee shop and drinking coffee together, getting to know the barista getting to know me, right? I've got my call, right? I've got friends. Oh, I've sit down. I've seen you. You've been here 20 times before, right? Let's strike up a conversation, right? Does that happen in a chocolate shop very often? I don't know that it does, right? In many cases, or at least we don't associate those kinds of rituals and that kind of community with eating chocolate. I buy a bar of chocolate and I go home and I eat it by myself, or I eat it, for the most part, that's the way it works, right? Right. And I think that that's one of the fundamental challenges when it comes to growing the world of craft and specialty chocolate, is building community, right? And building community around makers, and then building rituals around consumption. So how do I go about saying I am going to put together something? And it might be combining coffee with wine. It might be or chocolate with wine. It might be providing chocolate with beer. It might be combining chocolate with cheese. It might be, gathering around with friends on a regular basis and sharing things. Which combines community and ritual. We don't have either of those things. And we also don't have professional chocolate associations the same way we have professional association in wine, beer, and coffee. So there is no equivalent in chocolate of the specialty coffee association. The Fine Chocolate Industry Association, the Fine Cocoa and Chocolate Institute, they've been around, FCIA has been around for, I want to say 15 years now, or something like that. But it doesn't have the same cachet within the broader industry. It doesn't have the same influence within the broader industry that the Brewers Association does, or the Craft Brewers Association, or the Specialty Coffee Association. And so we need to understand why. Why is that the case? What has prevented the association of both professional and consumer associations in chocolate when I've got them all over the place for other things, right? Part of it is economic, I think. The average small chocolate maker doesn't have budget to do these things, whereas it takes a lot more investment to become a brewery. And as David said, there is this pipeline between home brewer associations and owning a brewery. And I know many people who've gone up that ladder, but it's different. It's different in chocolate in really, really fundamentally important ways. And we need to understand why. And why are there no professional associations in chocolate like there are in beer and wine and coffee and cheese? I mean, so why is there nothing like the Cheesemonger Invitational in chocolate? I mean, it's like it's a mystery to me. And then another thing that I didn't talk about from community rituals is that there is no publication in chocolate, right? So there is no publication around specialty chocolate the way there are specialty coffee zines, and they fanzines or professional zines. They just don't exist. I mean, David, let me step out of frame, right? So, right, right. David produces this thing called Final Gravity, and it's a quarterly beer zine, fanzine. It's a DIY fanzine, right? And nothing like that exists in chocolate, right? And not entirely certain why not. Anyway, these are the questions. These are primary questions that came out of me. These 4 points around how are beer and chocolate different. Number one is the understanding and the evolution of beer styles is very well understood, and it has very, very specific application. Beer styles exist in part or to facilitate judging, right? That's not the way the evolution of chocolate styles works at all, right? We don't have widely accepted definitions around, number one, styles, right? As well as vocabulary around bean to bar and craft and specialty and things like that, right? What it means to be these things. And then finally, the circumstances under which beer is consumed and wine are consumed and coffee are consumed tend to be very, very different from the circumstances around which chocolate or in which chocolate is consumed. And all 4 of these things, right, are, I think, sort of the elements of unlocking. They become the what I need to put the keys into and turn them, right, to unlock, maybe slice the Gordian knot in order to be able to figure out how to grow the specialty chocolate world. And what do you think? All right, what do you think about that? I'm really, really interested in knowing. So I'm going to close with a comment from Mark and Yuri at Blue Spruce Chocolates in Kittredge, Colorado, by saying, agreed. When someone asks what differentiates craft specialty chocolates, my answer is the intent of the maker, right? And thank you. Mine is the clearest statement that I have heard. Yeah, I think that, when I talked with David about this, David Nilsen about this, Mark, one of the things that we talked about again, right, was, when craft beer really became a movement, it was, we're going to define what we're doing in opposition to what industrial beer is, right? And it turned out that, when John Scharfenberger, opened up or started opening up Scharfenberger Chocolate Maker with Bob Steinberg, a lot of what it is that they were doing was thinking this is a reaction to French chocolate making, right? What we want to do is we want to create a uniquely American take at chocolate, right? This is not going to be Valrhona, for example. I remember having a conversation. It's been a long time, 2005, 2006, probably, since the last time I spoke to John in person around these kinds of concepts. Right shortly after the sale to Hershey, right, was probably the last time I talked with John about this topic specifically. But we need to understand that when the craft chocolate movement started, right, to gain steam in the mid 2000s, so 2004, when Chocolate Alchemy started being published, we find Amano and the early American craft chocolate makers, so Art Pollard and Amano, Sean Eskenazi, Alan McClure, Patrick, Stephen DeVries. I mean, I think of 4 of the early, very, very core influential American makers, right? A lot of what they were doing is they were defining things in opposition to European and industrial chocolate, and that's what they were doing. And so we need to be aware that that's where this modern specialty chocolate movement has come out of, right? But we need to be very careful about how we make that distinction, right, between what a craft or specialty chocolate maker is as opposed to what an industrial chocolate maker is. We can do that definition, but we need to be very, very careful that we do so in a way that says big chocolate isn't going to be able to pull it and start using our language against ourselves and sort of muddy the waters, right, in terms of how we describe ourselves and other sorts of people. But I think the key here is, as professionals, as people in the world of chocolate, we can focus on styles, right, and being clear about communicating styles. We can be clear about how styles have an impact on judging and what we're judging, and then communicate how clearly, right, how these two things work together and why we are conflating them, why are we putting them together. We want to be able to communicate clearly. And then what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to tell you why it's important to do it this way. And if you're in the world of beer, you get it, right? And I wanted to do, I'm gonna make another change here, which is I went and took a look and I said, okay, so Michael Jackson's first book is the World Guide to Beer. And so I did a quick search on Amazon. And what we do is we find there's a 1991 edition, there's a 97 edition, there's an 84 edition. But then we've got on the first page, these are all about styles of beer and guides to beer and new guides to beer and best beers and all this other kind of stuff. And, there are pages and pages and pages, right, of books which talk about beer styles. And so the entry point into this is really well understood. And there are hundreds of options that I can go to in order to be able to learn. Whereas I go and do the same phrase, the World Guide to Chocolate. So number one is I have a book from December of last year, self-published, A Delightful Introduction to the World of Chocolate, Indulge in the Sweet Aromas. I have no idea who the author is, Noel Carvalho, and where he's from. Again, it is a self-published book. I have Indulge in the World of Chocolate Mastery. So this is about chocolate appreciation. This first book here, The Delightful Introduction, is about chocolate appreciation and connoisseurship. This is about making chocolate, and I think chocolate making with mouth-watering recipes. I'm guessing it's about making bonbons, right? We have mindfulness is better than chocolate. So we're at like entry number 3, and we're talking about guides to chocolate tasting. This Chocolate for Complete Beginners is a technique book. This Andrew Baker is somebody that I follow on X/Twitter. He's a journalist. His father was a journalist, and he's somebody that knows a lot about chocolate in the UK. So if you ever wanted to go to the UK and wanted to do an in-depth view of chocolate in the UK, I would certainly get Andrew Baker's book and have carry it with me like I would carry a Frommer's or a Lonely Planet guide, right? In terms of understanding where to go. Great author. And then my book, right? Which is I'm glad to see that I hit the top 6. The book Making Chocolate from the guys at Dandelion, and then we've got a book on hair care, Escapes. I have no idea what that has to do with chocolate, and then we're into birds, right? This Mad Hatter Guides to Chocolate is a kid's book. I don't think it actually has anything to do with chocolate, right? Per se, cake decorating, and more birds. And I have no idea how we got from chocolate to birds, except I think it's World Guide. And what World Guide did is it got us to birds. But the point here is that we don't have the same foundational set of documents, books and references that we can get to, which help the person who is interested in learning this stuff. And that's, again, a fundamental difference between chocolate and beer, right? And so we have this notion of styles, how styles relate to judging, how judging, right, is going to be dependent on definitions and related vocabulary. And then finally, community and rituals is about communicating this. What are the vehicles that we're going to use to help people understand what the differences are, and to appreciate the differences are, and to get there? And so I think that when it comes to really understanding, right, the keys to why the world of chocolate might not be at the same level of sophistication and growth. I mean, while chocolate is a $180 billion a year industry, specialty chocolate or craft chocolate, maybe $2 billion a year, maybe 3, so somewhere between 1% and 2% of that. And so we've got a long way to go. Whereas specialty coffee is a huge percentage of the market, specialty beer is a huge percentage of the market, craft beer, collectible wine, that drives a lot of the wine market, but it is that understanding and appreciation, and rituals, places where we can come together and consume, which drive it all. And that's what I have to say. This is what I've been thinking about since I got off my episodes with Dave Nilsen on the Bean to Barstool podcast, as well as Pod Safe Chocolate a week ago. And I want to know what you think. Go into the comments on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook. Go into the comments on The Chocolate Life. And remember that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is sponsored by the members. If you like this video on YouTube, go give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and subscribe to thechocolateLife.com. I don't do Patreon. I'm not doing ads. Doing what it is that I do every week is dependent upon your support. And I appreciate it. And until the next time, everyone, remember, if you're working with chocolate and you are not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Ciao, everyone.